A lot of really good PC RPGs came out between 2007 and 2010 for some reason. You had Mass Effect 1 and 2, Dragon Age Origins, Mask of the Betrayer, Fallout 3, and New Vegas, and Mountain Blade all coming out within 3 years of each other. And kicking all that off was The Witcher, which I remember liking way better than all of those, except for maybe New Vegas. And I also remember the first year of that 2007 release being a pretty big deal for Eastern European developers. Because over there, The Witcher has been a little bit of a big deal for a long time. They advertise this stuff on billboards. Before the first game's release in 2007, The Witcher was already a well-established brand with this series of pulpy Polish paperbacks that were very highly regarded from the early 90s. The TV show, not so much though. Although over 2 million copies of the books were sold in Eastern Europe, it was almost 20 years before any of them were translated into English, and that move only came in 2007 with the worldwide release of the game. And just one sequel later, it suddenly turned into a symbol of some kind of international pride, with the Polish Prime Minister including a copy of it in Obama's care package during a meeting.
The Witcher.
Stworzono tutaj w Polsce Wiedźmina.
The latest game, though, has gone mainstream. With 8 million sales between all 3 games, it's easy to imagine these games eclipsing the books they were based on. So with the third game upon us, and with a lot of fond memories of the first, I decided to do it legit and play the whole series all over again, complete with a reading of The Last Wish. While this is actually the second book in the series, it's the one that fans generally recommend people read first. It's a collection of short stories that all take place in the beginning of the series timeline, and were actually published before the first book, just not in book form. It's pretty confusing because you have 2 anthologies of short stories before a saga of novels written as sequels to the anthologies, but anyways, let's see what's in here. The opening chapter details what would later become the first game's CGI intro, and a big discrepancy can be spotted right off the bat. In the book, the princess who gets turned into a beast is implied to be left mentally impaired for the rest of her life after Geralt breaks the curse. But in the game, she ends up fine, for a little while at least. She's named Princess Ada in the game, not to be confused with the Ada in the book who was her mother, but also briefly mentioned in the Journal of Witcher 2, and then when you throw in player-dependent chronologies at that point, you're juggling around like 4 different versions of Ada, but that's a mess. Anyways. The book is an easy and enjoyable read, but I feel like I'm missing out on a lot of its appeal by simply not being Polish. Some of the dialogue and word choices definitely look fishy, like how Geralt's horse is named Roach, which is supposed to be more of a reference to the fish rather than the insect, and also not to be confused with Vernon Roach from the games. The Geralt of this book is also a pretty different character from the one in this game. He's more cruel and violent, but he's also more talkative and lively. He has emotional needs. One entire chapter is him just monologuing about his feelings to a woman who isn't listening. You don't really get that from the game for the sake of role-playing, because the Geralt in the game has been written to not really know what's going on. And reading the book made me realize that the game wasn't just an attempt to homage these stories, it was also made to globalize them. At the end of the book series, Geralt dies, which would be a spoiler alert were it not the very first scene of the game, at which point the game's writers have pulled a whole new continuity out of their asses to keep him going. Having lost his memory from the supposed injuries, he knows just as much about the world as we do, letting a whole new audience discover this universe freshly, without having to go through a decade of source material. But what I did find enjoyable about going through the book was exactly what I found enjoyable about going back through the game. The Witcher advertises itself as a dark fantasy, which might conjure up dreary brown images of your Dragon Ages and Game of Thrones, but really, when you sit down and just look at the words on the page, or the images on the screen, it's quite idyllic, bright, colorful stuff. The Witcher is still a gorgeous game. A couple mods I put on buffed up the textures and let me turn off the HUD to keep this 8-year-old game flaunting environments that are just gorgeous to walk through and soak up. These lovely lakeside views and bustling medieval markets were built with a masterstroke of a map-making brush. Your advantaged viewing angles are crowded with lots of moving people and animals who follow a very detailed day and night schedule. The first Witcher game does 3 things very, very well: taverns, towns, and peasants. It's an obsessively detailed homage to the simple life, a pastoral ideal that's very warm and comforting until the inevitable climaxes of each act, when you learn it was all a lie. The taverns are dirty dens of drugs and violence, the towns are all ramshackle huts that don't pass a closer inspection, and the peasants resemble a scathing, almost hateful portrayal of feudal serf stereotypes. Their depravity rationalizes Geralt's own cynicism. The games go on to focus on the complicated pretend politics of this universe, but the first book shows a universe barely constrained by rules. It's a madhouse of fairy tales gone real, a collection of stories about talking monsters plucked from European folklore whose episodes always end with this edgy postmodern 90s twist in which Geralt has to decide what does and doesn't count as a monster. And I feel like the tone of that first book is best represented in Act 4 of the first game, whose surreal, fairy tale backdrop had me falling just as in love with this game as I was 8 years ago. Recognizing those fairy tales is important, and in Act 4 we have Arthurian and Lovecraftian influences easing The Witcher's new worldwide audience into something a little weird. Something that this new audience might find exotic. But up until that high point, much of the game is a slog. I can't believe how many people I've talked to who picked it up and got bored by the end of Act 1, which is sad. The Witcher has a serious pacing problem. Its main quests route you through incredibly inefficient fetches, from A to B, past long loading screens and longer walks, over and over again. It gets more time-consuming and technically unwieldy as the game goes on. Even on a modern system, you can still see this old Neverwinter Nights engine get absolutely stomped on by the trade quarter in Act 3. It's so crowded with poorly optimized NPCs that I can safely say that the first game actually performs worse than its sequel. Think about that. The glassed-over, dumb stare these models give each other is aging by the minute. Everyone looks worse than I remember. Some of these faces don't even look human. The lines they say aren't any better. It's clear that English wasn't the writer's first language and that the voice actors didn't exactly know what to do with this script. You really have to pass over a cringe curve before you can get into this game, but I still love it. Despite the superficial lack of humanity to all these people, there is an incredible amount of humanity to all these people. The world's economy and politics are clearly thought out, and so is the relationship between these characters. Even though Act 2 was this ungodly juggling act where you have to keep track of a huge list of something like 30 crisscrossing fetch quests between 15 NPCs who are all across 3 maps away from each other, I was still able to remember almost each and every one of them, every step of their convoluted ways. Everyone has their place. Every door leads somewhere special, with someone special behind it.
Oh, fuck off. We aren't all plowing philanderers. Some of us have depth.
Remember Grandma? I bet you do. Not just because she's a frustrating block between you and Shawnee's bedroom, but also because she has a room of her own secrets, including a diary from her childhood that hints at a lifetime of her own juicy bedroom encounters. The warmth and comfort of that idyllic world building extends to Geralt's own circle of friends. Imagine that. A pale-faced, gravelly, homicidal video game hero actually has friends. Real friends who all get drunk together and talk about their problems.
I know. Let's go to a whorehouse. Make it your stag night.
Dandelion, we were talking about relationships in case you didn't notice.
At its best moments, it's cute and funny. It's relatable. And then it throws something really weird at you completely out of left field that you just didn't see coming. And maybe that's the appeal of the books I wasn't noticing. It's not exactly a dark fantasy, it's not cynical. It is gritty, but it has a tinge of upbeat sarcasm about that. The first book is a collection of anecdotes about what would seemingly go wrong when a world full of as much socio-political bullshit as our own also has to put up with a bunch of supernatural bullshit to go with it. For the reader, all these monsters and curses have already existed in our own world for thousands of years, but as folklore, tropes, and cliches. The book smirks and says that if a big manly hero were to come out of nowhere to slice up a bunch of bad guys to save a damsel in distress just in time, she'd probably puke and pass out and he'd feel horribly guilty about the whole ordeal forever, and it would just be awkward for everyone. Although Geralt sure can hunt monsters and break curses super good, it doesn't exactly improve everyone's lives at the end of the stories. There's always a smarmy, ironic plot twist that just brings everyone back to where they started. So it takes itself seriously just when it feels the need to respond to tired conventions. And that's an interesting attitude to take in a genre dominated by overbearing convention, and in a product that relishes in some of the schlockiest conventions. The Witcher sure looks, feels, and sounds like your usual Tolkienian Western RPG, but somewhere deep down inside there, its values are very different. This game came from the last remaining pagan country in Europe. Act 4 has maypoles and goddesses, and people are frolicking around naked in the woods. It's nuts. And one thing I've actually never seen before in my entire life are these European versions of totem poles called Balvan. Good luck Googling that, because that's the same Polish word for snowman. Sourcing the fantasy of The Witcher is actually pretty hard to do. The Vodyanoi, Koshi, and Rusakas do share names, but not descriptions with Slavic folk creatures. But most of the quests in these games and the stories of the books are actually just retellings of Anglo-Saxon fairy tales, probably because a lot of truly unique Slavic folklore didn't survive. It wasn't written down during the pagan days, and afterwards it was actively suppressed during the Northern Crusades, which may nicely be analogous to The Witcher's monotheistic Order of the Flaming Rose, who fit the description of zealous Teutonic knights so well that it's hard not to make the comparison. But the rest of the motif seems to be your usual Norse elves and dwarves, as popularized by Tolkien and visualized by Peter Jackson. But for Westerners who aren't used to even the lightest of references to Iron Age Slavic mythology, there's just enough of a unique flavor in there to make this game a real treat. And that's what's fun about The Witcher. It's fun peeling back the layers, finding out the hidden depth behind what is a very drab game to look at, and a janky one to play. Geralt has a real problem with authority. Much of your combat is spent pressing buttons twice, because he doesn't seem to think you mean business the first time. Once you're locked in and fighting stuff, all you can really do is just click to make an animation play. But I still love it. I love all the grounded, lore-appropriate preparation you have to do ahead of time, and how much depth that adds to the gameplay that isn't even abstracted. There's a really complicated alchemy system that is actually perfectly explained by the lore. These characters look monstrous, everyone talks like there's something stuck up their ass, but I still love it. It's terrible. It's lovably terrible. It's completely shameless. Thanks to fantasy bullshit context, Geralt is immune and sterile, which means the writers gladly wrote in opportunities for him to have consequence-free casual sex with their motley assortment of sexually charged vending machines who get turned into baseball cards and shuffled away. Which, by the way, doesn't happen a lot in this book. The setups, the pickup lines, and the presentations are so bad, they are so hilariously bad, that I love it.
The fate of the world is in the balance, and you're thinking about sex?
Oh, what the hell. Strip.
But hey, at least one of those encounters seems kind of believable, which is like one more than most games have. I guess when you're going for a shotgun approach to deliberately filling your video game with as many bad sex scenes as possible, at least one of those pellets might hit the target. So that's great. Great standards I got here. If you try as hard as possible to be objective about it, then literally everything in The Witcher leaves room for improvement. Except the music. The music's objectively perfect because that's how that works. It's a game that barely holds itself together before the last chapter spams a bunch of enemies down a really long tunnel for a climax that was obviously phoned in. But I still love it, because they tried. God damn it, they tried. They tried really hard to make one of the most massive, reactive, and ambitious RPGs ever on a budget, on an outdated engine with a weird book franchise that everyone outside of their culture knew nothing about, and they actually did it. It's so good. It's still one of my favorite RPGs ever, and it's so bad, and that's great. Some of the most interesting games out there are the most flawed, and a lot of what I like about this first one is something the sequel kind of sandpapers away for the sake of polish. I guess I'll see for myself soon enough, as I continue to replay through The Witchers.